In a society where status dictates worth, Malcolm Dorsey, a successful black millionaire, disguises himself as a homeless man to uncover the truth behind people's motives. As he observes a beauty pageant focused on character rather than looks, he encounters Julia, a kind-hearted contestant who stands out from the rest. As he falls for her, a shocking revelation awaits. Can love thrive when secrets threaten to unravel everything? Will Julia's compassion be enough to bridge the gap between their worlds? Or will the truth tear them apart? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Malcolm Dorsey stood at the edge of his luxurious penthouse balcony, staring out at the glittering city skyline. The sprawling city, with its myriad lights blinking against the evening sky, was a view that most people would envy. For Malcolm, it was a constant reminder of the world he had conquered, a world that seemed smaller and less meaningful the more he achieved. He had everything society told him he should want: wealth, power, and influence. Yet, as the cold breeze ruffled his neatly trimmed hair, the same hollow feeling crept in, gnawing at his sense of purpose. 35 years old, Malcolm was a self-made millionaire. His business acumen had taken him from humble beginnings to being one of the most respected figures in the business world. Every day, his phone buzzed with offers, invitations, and messages from people who wanted to be close to him. But that was precisely the problem. No one seemed to want Malcolm for him. They wanted the millionaire, the public figure, the man who could open doors for them. His wealth had become a barrier between him and genuine human connection. His relationships, romantic and otherwise, had all followed the same pattern. Women were initially drawn to his success and the lifestyle it afforded them, but as time passed, they grew distant. It wasn't just the lifestyle they found unsatisfactory, it was him. Malcolm had often wondered if they saw him at all. The same went for his friendships. Many of his so-called friends were more interested in what they could gain from being associated with him than in who he really was. The glitz and glamour of his life had somehow turned him invisible. But that wasn't all. Being a black man in a predominantly white elite world had only made things more complicated. Success had not insulated him from prejudice. If anything, it made him a target for people's assumptions. Some looked at him with suspicion, assuming he had come by his wealth through underhanded means. Others acted as though he was an exception to the rule, implying that his success was somehow a rare fluke. Malcolm had spent his life defying stereotypes, but that didn't stop people from making them. He walked back into his penthouse, the sleek modern furniture a stark contrast to the growing unease in his chest. Every surface gleamed, reflecting his wealth, yet none of it mattered. He felt more alone than ever, surrounded by things that held no real value. He was tired of the superficiality. He was tired of people who only cared about appearances, about wealth and status. What Malcolm wanted, more than anything, was authenticity. He wanted to meet someone who could see beyond the surface, someone who would love him for the person he was, not the millionaire he had become. That's when the idea hit him, an idea so unorthodox, so absurd, that he almost laughed at himself. He would disguise himself as a homeless man, a beggar on the streets, to see how people treated him without the protection of his wealth and status. It was an extreme plan, but it excited him. It felt right. For weeks, Malcolm mulled over the idea. He thought about how people interacted with him when they knew who he was, and how different things would be if they thought he had nothing. Would they still smile at him? Would they still offer help or compassion? Or would they turn away, as if his value were tied solely to his bank account? The opportunity to test his theory came when he saw an advertisement for a local charity event. A beauty pageant, but not just any pageant. This one was different. It focused on community service, character, and inner beauty as much as outward appearance. The contestants were supposed to be women who wanted to make a difference, not just win a crown. The event was sponsored by a charity that Malcolm himself had supported in the past, and it was the perfect place for his experiment. He wasn't interested in the typical beauty pageant glitz. He wanted to see if any of these women had the depth of character he longed for, if they could look beyond the surface and show genuine kindness. But he wouldn't be attending as Malcolm Dorsey, the Millionaire sponsor. No, he would be just another person on the street, invisible and forgotten, to observe how they treated someone who seemingly had nothing to offer. Malcolm knew that appearances mattered in society, but he hoped there were still people who could see beyond them. This experiment would be his chance to find someone who valued kindness and compassion over wealth and fame. He called a close friend, Marcus, who ran a community outreach program. "I need your help," Malcolm said. "Sure, man. What's up?" Marcus replied. Malcolm hesitated for a moment, wondering how insane this would sound, but then he explained the plan. "I need you to help me look the part of a homeless man. Clothes, makeup, the works. I want to see how people treat me when they think I'm just another beggar." There was silence on the other end of the line, then Marcus burst out laughing. "You're serious?" "As serious as I've ever been." "You've lost it, Malcolm, but fine. I'll help. You realize people are going to treat you differently, right? You won't like what you see." "That's exactly what I need to see." A few days later, Malcolm was almost unrecognizable. Dressed in tattered clothes and a worn-out beanie, his once pristine appearance was buried under layers of dirt and grime. His hair was disheveled, his shoes scuffed, and his posture slouched. Even his gait had changed, taking on a more weary, beaten-down shuffle. Marcus had even applied some makeup to darken his skin tone slightly, giving him the appearance of someone who had spent years in the harsh elements. Looking at himself in the mirror, Malcolm felt a wave of discomfort. He wasn't Malcolm Dorsey anymore. He was just another homeless man, someone society preferred to ignore. That night, he stood outside the venue where the charity pageant was being held. The cold bit into his skin, but he didn't flinch. He leaned against a nearby wall, his head down, his hands tucked into the pockets of his ragged coat. He watched as people entered the building, the women in elegant gowns and the men in sharp suits. No one paid him any attention, just as he had expected. For the first time in years, Malcolm felt invisible. And that, oddly enough, was exactly what he wanted. The night was alive with the energy of the event, and Malcolm remained stationed near the entrance, taking in the scene unfolding before him. The grand venue, with its marble steps and crystal chandeliers visible through the windows, was a world he had known all too well. But tonight, standing outside in his ragged disguise, he was no longer part of that world. He had become an outsider, a beggar that no one noticed or acknowledged. The first few contestants arrived, stepping out of sleek cars with the confidence that came from being used to attention. Their gowns shimmered under the streetlights, and their heels clicked against the pavement as they made their way inside. Malcolm watched as they walked past him without so much as a glance. To them, he was invisible, a part of the city's background noise, like the streetlights or the parked cars. A group of young women, contestants clearly, stood just a few feet away from him, chatting excitedly about the night ahead. One of them, a tall blonde with a gleaming smile, glanced in his direction, her expression hardening. She nudged her friend, whispering something that made them both giggle, before quickly turning away. Malcolm caught the phrase, "doesn't belong here," slip from one of their mouths. He couldn't help but feel a pang of disappointment. He had expected this, but witnessing it firsthand still stung. The event was supposed to focus on character and community service, but it seemed that for many of the contestants, their concern for others was limited to the confines of the stage. As Malcolm stood silently, his mind wandered to the countless times he had faced similar judgments, both as a successful black man and now as a beggar. It didn't matter how much money he had or how many achievements were attached to his name. Some people would always see what they wanted to see. Tonight, they saw a beggar, and with that label came a host of assumptions. But Malcolm hadn't come here to wallow in disappointment. He was looking for something deeper, something real. He continued to observe, waiting to see if anyone would break the pattern. Then he noticed her. Julia arrived quietly, without the fanfare that seemed to follow the other contestants. She wasn't wearing the flashiest dress, nor did she exude the same overwhelming confidence. Her beauty was understated, natural. Her brown curls framed her face, and her eyes were bright with kindness, even as she approached the grand entrance. What struck Malcolm most, however, was the way she carried herself. There was a humility about her that set her apart from the others. As she neared the door, Julia slowed her pace, her eyes scanning her surroundings. Malcolm didn't expect her to notice him, not after everyone else had walked by without a second thought. But then, her gaze landed on him, and for a moment, their eyes met. Julia didn't look away. Instead, she walked toward him, her expression softening with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. Malcolm blinked, taken aback. He had been prepared to go through the entire night unnoticed, yet here she was, speaking to him as though he were a person, not just a part of the city's landscape. He struggled to respond, his throat tightening with the realization that someone had actually seen him. I'm fine," he finally managed, his voice rougher than he intended. He had to remember to stay in character. Julia's eyes searched his face, clearly unconvinced. She crouched down beside him, ignoring the curious glances from the people passing by. "You don't look fine. Have you eaten today?" she asked, her tone filled with genuine concern. Malcolm shook his head, unsure of what to say. "Stay right here," Julia said, standing up quickly. "I'll be back." Malcolm watched as she hurried inside, his mind racing. This wasn't what he had expected. She had stopped, she had seen him, and more than that, she had cared. It wasn't just pity, there was something authentic in the way she had spoken to him, in the way she had looked at him. A few minutes later, Julia returned with a small brown paper bag and a bottle of water. She handed them to him with a smile, her eyes warm. "I got you something to eat," she said. "I hope it helps a little." Malcolm took the bag, his hands trembling slightly. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude he hadn't expected to feel. Julia smiled again, but this time there was a hint of sadness in her expression. "You're welcome," she said softly. "Take care of yourself, okay?" With that, she stood up and walked away, blending into the crowd of contestants as she entered the venue. Malcolm sat there for a moment, staring after her, the weight of her simple act of kindness settling over him. He had come here to test people's character, to see if anyone would treat him with respect and compassion without knowing who he was. Julia had passed that test with flying colors, not because she had given him food, but because she had treated him like a human being. As the evening went on, Malcolm remained outside, continuing to observe the other contestants, but no one else came close to what Julia had done. Most of the women were preoccupied with their appearances, their conversations filled with superficial pleasantries. Malcolm couldn't help but feel disillusioned by how shallow it all seemed. Julia, however, remained in his mind. There was something different about her, something genuine. He had seen a glimpse of her true character, and it was enough to make him wonder if she was the one he had been searching for. But this was just the beginning. He needed to know more. He needed to be sure. The sun had begun to set, casting a golden glow over the event center as the evening's pageant events were about to commence. From his spot near the entrance, Malcolm could see the excitement building as guests arrived, some carrying small banners with their favorite contestant's name. It was a scene he had witnessed before at countless high society events, but this time it felt different. This time he was an outsider, not the man everyone came to impress. And for once, it felt freeing. But Malcolm wasn't here to feel free. He was here with a purpose. To observe, to test, and to find someone genuine. He had already been impressed by Julia's kindness earlier, but he wanted to see more. One small act of compassion wasn't enough to draw a final conclusion. People could be kind in fleeting moments, but he needed to know if that kindness was a core part of who she was. The pageant had been structured in a unique way. It wasn't just about beauty or poise. There were different challenges designed to test the contestants' problem-solving skills, creativity, and contributions to their communities. Malcolm had read up on the event beforehand, and that was part of what intrigued him. The contestants weren't just models. They were women who were supposed to care about the world around them. But was it real, or just a performance? As the contestants moved inside, Malcolm decided it was time to take his place inside the venue as well. He had purchased a ticket under a false name, one of the many perks of his plan to remain anonymous. Dressed in his beggar disguise, he doubted anyone would recognize him. To most people here, he would still be invisible. The first round of the pageant was about to begin when Malcolm took his seat in the back, unnoticed by the elegantly dressed crowd. The women walked across the stage one by one, introducing themselves and explaining their motivations for entering the competition. Some of them spoke about their dreams of becoming influencers or celebrities, while others discussed their desire to use the platform for good causes. It was a mix of genuine ambition and superficiality, as Malcolm had expected. When it was Julia's turn to speak, the room seemed to quiet down just a bit more. She stepped forward, her simple yet graceful presence commanding attention without demanding it. Malcolm leaned forward, curious to hear what she had to say. "I entered this competition not because I want to be famous," Julia began, her voice calm but confident, "but because I want to help those who don't have a voice. I've spent years working in my community, trying to make a difference where I can. There are people out there who are struggling, people who feel invisible, and I want to use any platform I have to change that. I believe that kindness isn't something you show just when people are watching. It's something you live by, day in and day out." Her words struck Malcolm deeply. They weren't rehearsed or filled with empty promises. They were simple, honest, and they aligned perfectly with the way she had treated him earlier. She wasn't just talking about helping others, she lived it. Malcolm felt a surge of admiration, but he forced himself to remain cautious. People could still surprise you, even when they seemed genuine. The second round of the pageant was a team challenge. The contestants were divided into groups and given a task. They had to come up with a project that would benefit the community and then present their ideas to a panel of judges. It was a test of creativity, leadership, and collaboration. Malcolm watched as the women discussed ideas, noticing how some of them took control, while others stayed quiet, content to let the more assertive personalities dominate the conversation. Julia, as it turned out, was in a group with some of the more competitive contestants. One of them, a woman named Alyssa, was particularly vocal. She was tall, with striking features and a polished demeanor, but Malcolm had already noticed her lack of interest in anyone she deemed beneath her. She had been one of the women who ignored him completely earlier that evening. As the group discussed their project idea, Alyssa immediately took charge. "I think we should focus on something that will really make us stand out," she said, her voice brimming with confidence. "Like organizing a high-profile fundraiser. Something big, something that will get people talking about us." The other women nodded in agreement, but Julia hesitated. "That's a great idea," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "But I think we should also think about how we can make a direct impact on people who are struggling right now. Maybe we could work with local shelters or food banks and focus on helping people immediately." Alyssa rolled her eyes. "That's not going to get us the kind of attention we need," she said dismissively. "We're supposed to be making a splash, not just doing small charity work." Julia didn't back down. "I don't think helping people in need is small charity work," she replied, her voice steady. "It's important, and if we do it right, people will notice because it's genuine." There was a brief moment of tension as Alyssa stared Julia down, clearly annoyed at being challenged. Malcolm held his breath, waiting to see how Julia would handle the situation. Would she cave to the pressure, or would she stand by her values? To Malcolm's surprise, Julia didn't relent. She continued to advocate for her idea, even as Alyssa and a few others pushed for something flashier. Eventually, the group compromised, deciding to include Julia's idea in their proposal. It wasn't the complete victory Malcolm had hoped for, but it was enough to show him that Julia had integrity. She wasn't afraid to stand up for what she believed in, even when it wasn't the popular choice. As the group presentations began, Malcolm couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as Julia's team took the stage. They presented their project with professionalism and poise, and Julia's contribution was clearly highlighted. When the judges asked questions, she answered thoughtfully, emphasizing the importance of helping those who are often overlooked by society. Her words resonated with the audience, and Malcolm could tell that the judges were impressed. But more than that, Malcolm was impressed. Julia had shown him time and again that she was different. She didn't just talk about kindness and compassion, she embodied those values in everything she did. And it wasn't for show. She wasn't doing it to win points or impress the judges. It was simply who she was. As the night went on, Malcolm continued to watch Julia closely. She never once broke character or wavered in her convictions. Even when the cameras weren't on her, she remained true to herself, helping the other contestants and treating everyone she encountered with respect. She wasn't perfect, but she was real. And that, more than anything, was what Malcolm had been searching for. By the end of the night, Malcolm had seen enough to know that Julia was special. But there was still one final test he needed to put her through. A test that would reveal whether her kindness extended beyond the pageant, beyond the spotlight, and into the everyday moments that truly mattered. And for that, he would have to reveal who he really was. The pageant had come to an end for the evening, but Malcolm's internal deliberations had only just begun. He had spent the entire day observing Julia, watching how she interacted with others, and how she navigated the challenges placed before her. Each time, she had proven herself to be more than just a contestant trying to win a crown. She was genuine, thoughtful, and principled. But there was still one lingering question in Malcolm's mind. Could her kindness hold steady if she knew who he truly was? As the guests and contestants began to trickle out of the venue, Malcolm slipped out the back, disappearing into the shadows of the nearby alleyways. His disguise still in place, he felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him. It was time to reveal the truth, but he needed one last moment to see how Julia would react when faced with real adversity, outside the structured environment of the pageant. A plan began to form in Malcolm's mind. He would create a situation that tested not only Julia's kindness, but also her integrity and her ability to care for someone in genuine need. He had already seen how she treated him when he was just a beggar on the street, but now he needed to know if that same empathy extended beyond simple charity. Would she go the extra mile for someone in distress? Was her compassion truly unconditional, or had it been influenced by the pageant's circumstances? Malcolm decided to stage a scenario that would push her limits. He didn't want to trick her, but he needed to see her authentic reaction to a situation that wasn't in the controlled environment of the pageant. He would place himself in a position where he was in need of more than just food or water, a position that required real sacrifice from her. The next day, Malcolm returned to his beggar's persona and positioned himself near the coffee shop where he had learned Julia liked to stop in the mornings. This wasn't an accident. He had gathered enough information from the small interactions with her and the other contestants to know her daily routine. This time, he wasn't waiting with a sign or sitting idly by. He was going to put his plan into action. As the sun climbed higher, Julia eventually appeared, walking briskly down the sidewalk with her hair tied in a loose bun, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater. She had her usual soft smile, and her pace suggested she was running a bit late. Malcolm knew that this was the moment. He staggered out from behind a row of parked cars, pretending to be injured. He had torn his clothes slightly more than usual and added some makeup to make his face look bruised. As he stumbled into view, he allowed himself to collapse onto the pavement with a groan, making sure the scene looked as realistic as possible. Julia noticed him immediately. Her steps faltered, and for a moment Malcolm saw the concern flash across her face. She rushed over to him, her coffee forgotten. "Oh my God, are you all right?" she asked, kneeling beside him without hesitation. There was no fear in her eyes, no hesitation in helping a stranger. "What happened? Are you hurt?" Malcolm grimaced and mumbled, I fell. I don't know. Everything hurts." Julia quickly scanned him for injuries, her hands moving gently but efficiently as she checked for signs of serious damage. "You need to get to a hospital," she said, her voice firm with concern. "I can't afford that," Malcolm muttered, keeping his eyes low, playing his role. "I don't have insurance. I don't even have a place to stay." Julia bit her lip, glancing up and down the street as if looking for someone to help. When no one else came forward, she sighed and pulled out her phone. "Look, I don't have a lot of money, but I can call an ambulance, and I'll help you figure out the rest." Malcolm shook his head. "No, please. No ambulance. I just can't afford it." Julia hesitated, clearly torn between wanting to get him the proper care and respecting his wishes. "Then, come with me," she finally said, standing and offering him a hand. "I live nearby, I'll get you cleaned up, and we'll figure out what to do next." Malcolm blinked in surprise. This was more than he had expected. Julia was offering not just help, but her home, a gesture that went beyond simple charity. He allowed her to help him to his feet, feeling the weight of her genuine concern pressing on him. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice soft, testing her resolve. "Of course," she replied without hesitation. "You can't stay out here like this. Let's get you cleaned up, and then we'll talk about what to do next." As they made their way toward her apartment, Malcolm felt an unexpected pang of guilt. This had been a test, but Julia's reaction was so pure, so selfless, that it made him question his own methods. She was willing to bring a complete stranger into her home, not out of pity, but because she truly believed it was the right thing to do. They reached her modest apartment, and Julia helped Malcolm inside, guiding him to sit on the couch. She moved around with quiet efficiency, retrieving a first aid kit and wet towels. As she gently cleaned the fake wounds on his face, Malcolm watched her closely. She didn't flinch or hesitate, even though she had no idea who he was or where he had come from. "There," she said softly as she finished, sitting back to examine her work. "It doesn't look too bad. I still think you should see a doctor, but I understand if that's not an option for you right now." Malcolm nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He had seen enough. More than enough. Julia had passed every test he could think of, and with flying colors. She wasn't just kind when it was convenient or when there were cameras watching. She was kind because it was who she was at her core. And Malcolm realized in that moment that he had found what he was looking for. The woman in front of him wasn't just compassionate, she was everything he had hoped to find in someone. It was time to tell her the truth. "Julia," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of everything he was about to reveal. "There's something I need to tell you." She looked at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "What is it?" Malcolm took a deep breath and slowly began to wipe away some of the dirt from his face, revealing the man underneath the disguise. Julia's eyes widened as recognition began to dawn on her. He watched the confusion flash across her face as she pieced it together. "I'm not who you think I am," Malcolm said, his voice steady. "My name is Malcolm Dorsey. I'm a businessman, a millionaire, and I've been watching you." Julia took a step back, her hand instinctively going to her chest. "What are you talking about?" "I needed to find someone who was real," Malcolm continued, his heart racing. "Someone who could see beyond money, beyond appearances. So I disguised myself as a beggar to see how people would treat me. And you've treated me with nothing but kindness from the very beginning." Julia's eyes were wide, her mind clearly racing to process what he had just said. "So, this was all a test? You were testing me?" Malcolm winced at the accusation in her tone. "I didn't mean to deceive you, not like this. But yes, I needed to see if you were as genuine as I thought you were. And you are, Julia. You're everything I've been looking for." For a long moment, Julia didn't say anything. The weight of Malcolm's confession hung in the air between them, heavy and raw. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, shaking her head. "This is a lot." "I know," Malcolm said, stepping toward her cautiously. "I know I've put you in a difficult position, but I needed to see for myself if there was anyone out there who could love me for me, not for my money." Julia met his gaze, and in her eyes, Malcolm could see the depth of her confusion, but also her compassion. She took a deep breath before responding. "Malcolm," she said softly, "I don't know how to feel about this right now. You lied to me, but I can see why you did it, and honestly, I don't know what I would have done in your shoes." Her words were like a balm to his soul, but he knew he had to give her time. "I understand," Malcolm said. "Take all the time you need. I just needed you to know the truth." Julia nodded slowly, still processing everything. The room fell into silence as they both stood there, the weight of the moment heavy between them. The silence between Malcolm and Julia felt like an eternity. Julia's eyes remained fixed on Malcolm's face, processing the weight of his confession. There was no anger in her expression, but there was a quiet hurt, a kind of betrayal that Malcolm had expected, but still found difficult to bear. He had always known that this moment would be fraught with tension, but the reality of it felt heavier than he had imagined. "Why didn't you just tell me the truth from the beginning?" Julia finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Malcolm sighed, running a hand through his now unkempt hair. "Because I didn't know how you'd react if you knew who I was. People? They treat me differently when they know I have money. They either want something from me, or they push me away because they think I live in a different world. I've been searching for someone who would see me for the man I am, not the millionaire." Julia blinked, her emotions still swirling. "I understand that. But it doesn't change the fact that you lied to me. You created this situation, this test, and I didn't even know I was part of it." Malcolm's heart sank as he heard the tremble in her voice. She was right. He had manipulated the situation, even if his intentions had been pure. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice sincere. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I just needed to know that you were real." Julia sat down slowly on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped in her lap. "I was real the whole time, Malcolm. I was always real. But now I'm questioning if you were." Malcolm opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He hadn't expected this kind of reaction, her questioning his authenticity. He had spent so long hiding behind his disguise, convincing himself that he was protecting his true self, that he hadn't considered how much it might distance him from the very truth he was seeking. I am real, Julia," Malcolm said, finally finding his voice. "This is who I am, under all of it. I didn't expect you to understand right away, but I want you to know that everything I felt for you, everything I've seen in you, it's real. That's why I had to tell you the truth." Julia didn't respond immediately. She remained quiet, her thoughts clearly racing. Malcolm watched her carefully, his heart in his throat as the minutes stretched on. Finally, she stood up, meeting his gaze with an intense but unreadable look in her eyes. "I need time to think," she said softly. "This is a lot to process." Malcolm nodded, resisting the urge to push for more. He knew that pressing her for an immediate answer would only complicate things. "I understand," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Take all the time you need. I just hope that you'll understand why I did what I did." Julia gave him a small, sad smile before nodding. "I'm not sure I understand it all right now, but I'll try. I need to be alone for a while." Without another word, she walked him to the door. The finality of the moment hit Malcolm like a tidal wave as he stepped out into the hallway. Julia's kindness and empathy had drawn him to her. But now that she knew the truth, the future felt uncertain. He turned one last time before she gently closed the door behind him, leaving him standing alone in the quiet corridor. The days that followed felt unbearably long. Malcolm tried to go about his normal life, returning to his office, attending meetings, and maintaining the image of the successful businessman. But his mind was never fully present. He couldn't stop thinking about Julia, wondering what she was thinking, whether she would reach out to him, and if he had ruined everything with his deception. He hadn't expected this level of guilt. His plan had been to protect himself, to shield his heart from the superficiality of the world. But now he realized that his approach had backfired. He had found someone genuine, someone who truly saw people for who they were, and in doing so, he had risked losing her by not being honest from the start. Then one morning, as Malcolm sat in his office, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Julia. "Can we meet? I think we need to talk." His heart raced as he read the words. He quickly responded, agreeing to meet her at a quiet cafe they had both frequented, one far from the public eye. It was the same cafe where Julia had unknowingly passed by him while he was disguised as a beggar. The irony wasn't lost on him as he walked there, unsure of what the conversation would bring. When Malcolm arrived, Julia was already seated at a table near the back, a cup of coffee in front of her. She looked calm, but there was a seriousness in her eyes that made Malcolm's nerves intensify. He took a deep breath and approached the table, sitting down across from her. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Malcolm said softly, his hands resting on the table. Julia nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "I've had a lot to think about," she said, her voice measured. "What you did, it was hard for me to wrap my head around, but I've had some time to reflect." Malcolm held his breath, waiting for her next words. "I understand why you felt the need to test people," Julia continued, her gaze steady. I've seen how people treat you, how they make assumptions based on appearances, and I know how frustrating and lonely that can be. But what I realized is that the problem wasn't just that you tested me. It was that you didn't trust me enough to show me who you really were." Malcolm felt the weight of her words. She wasn't angry, but her disappointment cut deep. "You're right," he admitted, his voice low. "I didn't trust anyone, and that's on me. But I trust you now. Completely." Julia nodded, her expression softening. "I think you've been carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders for too long, Malcolm. You don't have to test people to find someone who cares about you. You just have to be willing to open up, to be vulnerable." Her words hit him like a revelation. He had spent so much time guarding himself, assuming that no one could love him for who he truly was, that he had forgotten the power of vulnerability. He had been too afraid to let anyone in, too afraid of being judged, when all he really needed was to let someone see him, truly see him. "I know that now," Malcolm said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "And I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. You've been nothing but kind to me, and I didn't give you the same in return." Julia smiled gently. "You did, in your own way. It just took a little while for the truth to come out." For the first time since their conversation had begun, Malcolm allowed himself to breathe. Julia's forgiveness wasn't immediate or simple, but it was real. She wasn't brushing aside the hurt, but she was willing to move forward with understanding. "So, where do we go from here?" Malcolm asked cautiously. Julia took a deep breath, her fingers still tracing the edge of her cup. "I'm willing to move forward, Malcolm, but we have to be honest with each other. No more tests, no more disguises, just you and me, as we are." Malcolm's heart swelled with gratitude and hope. "No more disguises," he promised. "Just me and you, and whatever comes next." As weeks passed, Malcolm and Julia's relationship deepened. They spent more time together, not getting to know each other without the barriers of pretense or suspicion. The connection they had forged during Malcolm's experiment grew into something genuine and lasting. Julia's forgiveness and Malcolm's newfound willingness to be vulnerable allowed them to build a foundation of trust and understanding. And in the end, karma did its work. The women who had dismissed Malcolm during the pageant, treating him as though he were invisible or beneath them, found their own paths riddled with the consequences of their superficiality. They didn't suffer from Malcolm's direct hand, but life had a way of teaching its own lessons. Their own opportunities for growth, connection, and genuine success slipped through their fingers, leaving them to wonder what they had missed. As for Malcolm, he finally found what he had been searching for, not just in Julia, but in himself. He had learned that real love and connection weren't something you tested or controlled. They were something you had to be open to, something you had to earn by being true to yourself. And with Julia by his side, Malcolm realized that the wealth he had accumulated over the years paled in comparison to the value of a heart that saw beyond appearances, beyond wealth, beyond the surface. Together, they built something real, something that no disguise could hide and no test could destroy. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.